In the grand, tragic theatre of imperial history, the greatest calamities are seldom born of external force. They fester from within. A rot of the soul, a corruption of faith, a single voice whispering poison into a willing ear. For an age of light can be ended not by a conquering horde, but by the quiet, patient work of one true believer in a darker truth. Before you is a picked capture of a forbidden artifact, a star chart of damnation. It is titled simply Erebus, Architect of the Heresy. Here we see the web he wove, its crimson strands representing the lies, the manipulations, and the false prophecies that ensnared the mightiest of the Primarchs. This is the Anathame of a Demigod's Betrayal, a dissection of how the first chaplain of the Word-bearers, a master of the esoteric and the profane, orchestrated the fall of the peerless Warmaster Horus himself. The glowing constellations are not of old Terra, but the star lanes of the Great Crusade, their paths perverted by the Colchisian runes that circle the abyss, twisting destiny to a catastrophic new design. How does one man, even an Astartes, achieve such a galactic ruin? Not with a legion's might, but with the precise application of knowledge that should never have been learned. He did not simply kill a demigod's loyalty, he dissected it, piece by piece, and rebuilt it into a monument of treason. To understand the Horus heresy, one must first understand the architect who drew its foul blueprints. To turn a son against a father, one must first make him an orphan. Not by striking the father down, but by walling the son away, piece by agonizing piece, until he believes himself utterly alone in a hostile cosmos. This was the dark science applied to Horus Lupercal, a masterpiece of damnation we can now see in its horrifying entirety. The blueprint of betrayal. It was a strategy of 4 distinct yet interwoven vectors of isolation. It began with the physical, a simple but effective trap laid on the feral moon of Davin. There, the Warmaster was struck down not by a common blade, but by a Kinabrak anathame, a weapon poisoned with the essence of the warp. This was the snare on Davin, designed not merely to kill, but to create a wound that imperial science could not comprehend. This led to the rational isolation. As Horus lay dying, his own peerless apothecarian was bypassed. Trust was subverted. Reason was cast aside in favor of the esoteric rituals of Davin's Serpent Lodge cultists. His care was surrendered to the very architects of his demise. Concurrently, the campaign of diplomatic isolation was finalized. The burgeoning peace with the Interex, a Xenos culture that understood the nature of chaos and could have warned Horus, was deliberately shattered by the actions of Erebus. A vital external perspective was extinguished, leaving Horus surrounded only by echoes of his own rising doubts. Finally, within the crucible of his poisoned fever dream, the spiritual isolation was achieved. Cut off from the Emperor's light, Horus was subjected to the Empyrean illusion, a curated tour of his own soul where pride was stoked, resentment was nurtured, and the truth of the Imperium was twisted into a lie. He was shown a future of tyranny, his father a nascent, uncaring god. He was made to feel abandoned, betrayed, and righteous in his own rebellion. Each stage was a lock, and with each turn of the key, Horus was drawn further into a prison built within his own heart. But this blueprint, this chillingly precise diagram of a single soul's destruction, was never intended for just one man. It was a template. A question, therefore, haunts the vaults of this administratum. While the galaxy's eyes were fixed on the Warmaster's fall, what other snares were being laid? What other isolations were being engineered for his brothers? The peace with the Interex, a potential masterstroke of imperial diplomacy, was not undone by a clash of armies, but by a single, calculated act of perfidy. A theft, in the hallowed Hall of Devices. As this chart of ruin illustrates, the path to galactic civil war began with a simple lie. First Chaplain Erebus of the Word-Bearers, moving unseen, secretly stole a chaos-tainted artifact from the Zenobia armory of our would-be allies. He did not act for the Imperium, he acted to frame it. The reaction was as swift as it was predictable. The Interex, a society already aware of the great enemy and hyper-vigilant against its touch, saw only Imperial treachery. All trust evaporated. This promising alliance with a technologically advanced, chaos-aware human civilization was obliterated in a storm of sudden, brutal bloodshed. Yet, the true target of this entire affair was not the Interex. It was one man. The psychological impact on the Warmaster was devastating. Horus, the master of diplomacy, was plunged into a deep, corrosive melancholy. He was consumed by regret and self-doubt over the failure, leaving his humors unbalanced, his peerless mind made vulnerable. For the Architects of Heresy, the destruction of the Interex was merely the bait. The true prize was the Warmaster's despair. A mind so wounded, so open to suggestion, would soon seek a cure for its pain, no matter the cost, and no matter who offered it. A weapon crafted not for a species, but for a single life. It was a concept of murder, given physical form and a name, the Anathame. Its origins are traced to the long-dead Kinebrak, a sentient Xenos race whose artifice was inherently and inextricably tied to warp sorcery. This was no mere blade of forged steel. It was a sliver of intelligent malice. The weapon's core principle was a terrifying concept known as genetic resonance. The sentient metal itself, alive in a way we can barely comprehend, could recognize and attune itself to the unique genetic signature of a chosen target. It did not simply cut, it hunted. Once unleashed, the Anathame delivered its true payload, the unhealable wound. It was designed with one victim profile in mind, a Primarch. The blade was engineered to bypass their transhuman physiology, inflicting a complex hypoxic and systemic poison that defied all Imperial science. Even the blessed Laraman cells, the very bedrock of Astartes' resilience, were rendered inert and useless against its esoteric venom. Such an instrument of calculated damnation would not lie dormant. It had a purpose, an appointment with destiny, and it would soon find the hand that would carry it to its fateful work. The War Council of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet fell silent. Into the strategy chamber strode Erebus, first chaplain of the Word-Bearers, a shadow cloaked in ceramite and ill omen. His words, like the foul vapor depicted in the Pict capture, cut through the din of tactical debate with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The news he brought was of a fire lit on a world Horus himself had brought to compliance. Davin. Its governor, Eugen Temba, a man placed in his seat of power by the Warmaster's own decree 6 decades prior, had declared for himself. A petty rebellion on a feral moon, a matter for the Imperial army, perhaps. But this was not how Erebus presented it. The chaplain reframed the act. It was not a failure of administration, he hissed, but an act of profound personal heresy. Erebus claimed the governor had spat upon his solemn oaths and, in the most egregious blasphemy, branded the mighty Horus the lackey of a fallen god, a calculated, poisoned dart aimed directly at the Warmaster's warrior pride. The truth of Temba's words mattered little. The insult had been delivered, the venom injected. Pride, the flaw that lies coiled at the heart of all great men, had been awoken. The rebellion on Davin's moon was no longer a logistical problem to be solved, but an honor debt that could only be paid in blood. And in his rage, the Warmaster failed to see the true architect of his fury, or the nature of the trap that was now closing around him. Pride, the most potent and tragic flaw of the demigod. It was this singular vulnerability that the architects of the heresy chose as their point of entry, weaponizing the Warmaster's own character against him through a devastatingly simple reverse psychology matrix. Examine the archival data. The trap was not sprung with a single overture, but a sequence of calculated statements, each with a venomous, covert intent. First, the insult, delivered secondhand. Temba claims you are a lackey, a petty slight from a dead man, yet it was precision-engineered to trigger Horus's immense pride and ego, blinding him to tactical reason. Second, the dismissal of the supernatural. They used sorcery and magic. This masterstroke preyed upon Horus's rigid adherence to the secular imperial truth, ensuring he would fatally underestimate the warp threat, viewing it as primitive superstition rather than a tangible power. Finally, the challenge to his honor. Let subordinates handle this matter. This guaranteed that Horus, his honor already stained and his pride inflamed, would insist on leading the spear-tip assault personally. Each statement was a key, turning a lock in the Warmaster's soul. The psychological architecture of his fall was now complete. He was goaded, blinded, and aimed like a living weapon at his own damnation. The Warmaster would descend to the planet's surface not as a general, but as an aggrieved warrior seeking personal vindication, precisely as his enemies intended. Revenge guided the Warmaster into a calculated wilderness of the soul. Phase 3 of the enemy's design was not a battle, but a snare, its jaws fashioned from a world's death throes and a Primarch's own wounded pride. The environment itself was an active antagonist. Before him lay a feral, decaying landscape of fetid bogs, a geography of ruin that exhaled a thick, yellow fog. This pestilential shroud served a tactical purpose, engineered to separate the members of the Mournival and disorient the legionaries of the Sons of Horus. In the center of this suffocating gloom, a lure, the target, the wreck of the glory of Terra. Once a proud imperial vessel, Temba's crashed flagship had been gruesomely rewired, as the logs state, transformed into a charnel house of the warp, a fusion of plasteel and nightmare. It was towards this monument of his failure that Horus pushed forward, alone, a singular vector of purpose driven by vengeance. His fury provided the perfect catalyst, isolating him from his captains just as the enemy had intended. Every step deeper into the fog was a step away from his sons, from his reason. The greatest strategist in the galaxy, a master of legions, had been reduced to a lone warrior seeking a ghost, never once suspecting the true nature of the hunter that awaited him inside that corrupted tomb. Yujin Temba was no longer a man. The trusted Imperial Army commander, once a brother-in-arms to the Warmaster himself, now stood before him as a bloated, weeping parody of life, a vessel for the pestilential energies of the plague god, Nurgle. The duel that followed was a clash of myth and nightmare. Horus Lupercal, peerless in all martial disciplines, moved with a speed and grace that belied his immense power. But against him, Temba was unnaturally resilient. In the chaos of the fetid swamp, a single mistake was made. The foul blade known as the Anathame, a relic of insidious power, struck true. It was not mere adamantium that was breached, but the very sanctity of a Primarch. The sentient weapon delivered its poison, a toxin exquisitely tailored not for a man, but for a demigod. The effect was immediate, catastrophic. The Warmaster crashed to the mud, corpse-like, before the horrified eyes of his inner circle, the Mournival, Abaddon, Aximand, Torgadon, and Loken. The impossible had happened. Their invincible father was brought low. For a Primarch, there is no simple death. The wound from the Anathame was more than physical. It was a deep, spiritual corruption, a poison seeping into the Warmaster's very soul. As he lay dying upon that cursed moon, beyond the aid of any legion apothecary, his sons were left with a terrible, frantic desperation. And in the shadows, forces long waiting for this exact moment prepared to offer them a cure for a price. Imperial science, the very bedrock of the Great Crusade's logic, shattered against the dying form of the Warmaster. In the sterile confines of the Apothecarian, the lauded Laraman cells met a foe they could not conquer. Apothecary Vadon's every artifice failed. The Anathame's poison was not merely a biological agent, it was a curse given physical form, and Horus's superhuman physiology was shutting down. This was not a simple failure of medicine. It was the planned and systematic dismantling of hope, a rational isolation executed with chilling precision. The key to any scientific cure, the weapon itself, was not available for study. In the chaos of the battle and the frantic evacuation, the Anathame had not been secured. Without the source of the affliction to analyze, the apothecaries were working blind, their science rendered impotent against a wound of purely esoteric nature. This vacuum of knowledge was the opening the conspirators needed. As Horus's life dwindled, they argued that time was running out. The path of logic and reason was presented as a dead end, a slow death sentence. The last avenue for a rational solution was sealed not by a lock and key, but by the crushing weight of a ticking clock, forcing the Mournival toward the dark alternative offered by the Serpent Lodge. In the utter absence of hope, what desperate bargains might a loyal son make to save his father? What saviors wait in the shadows when the surgeons have failed? A single life was weighed against the truth of a galaxy. On one plate of the scales, the shattered orb of imperial truth and reason, the very foundation of the Great Crusade. On the other, the solitary, guttering light of the Warmaster's life. Into this moment of despair stepped the word-bearer, Erebus. He offered not a cure, but what he called a solution, the forbidden knowledge and mystical healing arts of the Davinite Serpent Lodge. Here was the devil's bargain, preying on the absolute devotion of the Mournival. They were faced with an impossible choice. Let their father, their Primarch, die pure, a martyr to the cause he championed, or save him by embracing the very mystic arts they had sworn to eradicate. Grief became the agent of corruption. The fracture was immediate and absolute. The first captain, Ezekiel Abaddon, and Horus Aximand, his so-called Little Horus, could not bear the loss. Their love and sorrow were the levers Erebus used to topple an empire. The dissenting voices of Garviel Loken and Tarek Torgadon, who argued for reason and law, were overruled. The decision was made. Horus was delivered to the cultists. The scales tipped. The pact was sealed. And in the dark temples of Davin, a bargain was honored not with coin or promise, but with the soul of a son and the future of mankind. For in choosing life, the Mournival had just embraced a far more profound and eternal death. The Warmaster's body lay dying, a vessel poisoned and broken, but his essence had been violently torn from it. His spirit was now elsewhere. This period is recorded in the Forbidden Archives as Phase 4, Spiritual Isolation in the Empyrean. Horus's spirit, detached from his dying body, was cast into the non-space of the warp. As this pict capture illustrates, the golden, stoic mask of his identity began to fracture, revealing the swirling madness of the immaterium beneath, a warp illusion overlay upon his very soul. He was lost, vulnerable, and completely cut off from the material realm. The ruinous powers, observing his isolation, understood that a frontal assault would only martyr him. They did not attack him with monsters. Instead, with patient, malevolent genius, they sent an architect. For what is the strength of a Primarch against a foe who will not fight, but will instead rebuild reality around you, brick by painful memory? The true battle for the Warmaster's soul was not a clash of arms, but a subtle, insidious deconstruction. Into the fever dream of the wounded Warmaster, a ghost stepped forth from the Empyrean. Not a monster, not a fiend, but the face of his most beloved, recently mourned captain, Hastur Sejanus. It was the perfect key, forged from grief, designed to unlock a mind fortified against all but the most trusted of voices. This was no random phantasm. In-system archives refer to the event as the Illusion Architecture, a tripartite assault on the very soul of the Primarch Horus. The first node, as we see diagrammed, weaponized trust. By wearing the stolen face of Sejanus, the architect of this betrayal, the word-bearer Erebus bypassed all suspicion. With Horus's defenses lowered, the second node was deployed, validation, through the poison of a half-truth. Erebus revealed genuine imperial secrets, the hidden Primarch laboratories, the Emperor's grand, silent ambitions for ascension, framing them not as a plan for humanity's salvation, but a selfish quest for godhood. This seed of truth gave vile credence to Horus's deepest resentments. Finally, with the Warmaster's heart compromised by grief and his mind clouded by validated doubt, Erebus initiated the third node, ambition. The manipulator reframed history, casting the Emperor as a distant tyrant abandoning his sons, and positioned Horus, the favored son, as the only one with the strength and vision to truly rule the galaxy. It was a promise of power, whispered by a ghost to a demigod poised at the precipice of damnation. An architecture of lies built upon a foundation of truth, grief, and ambition. Each node, each vector of attack was meticulously designed not merely to sway the Warmaster, but to fundamentally rewrite his being. The illusion was never meant to be temporary. It was the scaffold for building a new god, a dark mirror to the master of mankind. Trapped within the fever dream of the serpent's venom, the Warmaster's soul became a battleground. It was here, in the space between life and death, that the fate of the Imperium would be contested not by legions, but by whispers. Two apparitions vied for his allegiance. The first, Erebus of the Word-Bearers, wore the face of a ghost, the comforting, trusted visage of Horus's slain and beloved son, Captain Sejanus. His tactic was not one of argument, but of affirmation. He validated the Warmaster's deepest anger and fears, validating every suspicion of abandonment. The leverage he applied was Horus's own pride, weaponized against him. Against this seductive poison stood the tortured form of a brother, Magnus the Red. He appeared not as a sibling, but in a startling, demonic-adjacent form, a psychic chimera, part wolf, part cyclops. His approach was abrasive, demanding blind obedience and faith in the Emperor. He appealed to Horus's sense of duty and the cold, absolute tenets of the imperial truth, offering no solace. Ultimately, the choice was not between truth and lies, but between comfort and duty. Erebus won by telling Horus exactly what his wounded heart wanted to hear. Magnus lost by confronting him with a terrible reality he refused to accept. The soul of the Warmaster was not conquered. It was surrendered for a moment of solace, and with it, the promise of a united galaxy burned away. The damnation of a Primarch was not an accident of fate, but a masterpiece of conspiracy. In the secret archives of the Logister Veritas we find this schematic, this dreadful cartography known as the Funnel of Isolation. It is not a map of territory, but of a soul's systematic destruction. The descent began at the widest part of the funnel, Layer 1, the diplomatic. The fabric of trust, woven over centuries of crusade, was deliberately unpicked. Peace was destroyed, and potential allies alienated, until the Warmaster's circle of counsel had shrunk to include only the whispers of the serpent. Then came Layer 2, the physical catalyst, the wound. On the feral moon of Davin, Horus was struck down by a blade of foulest make. Separated from the bulk of his legion, from the steadying presence of his loyal sons, he was vulnerable. This vulnerability was exploited in Layer 3, the medical. The proven science of the Imperium, The skill of his own apothecaries fails. They were bypassed, dismissed. In their place, the shamanistic rites of the Davinite cults were offered. As these foul energies worked, the final layer was achieved. Layer 4, the spiritual. The ritual did not just heal his body, it scoured his soul, cutting him off from the psychic light of the Emperor. The warnings of his most loyal brothers were rejected, unheard in the roaring silence. Each layer constricted his reality, stripping away another anchor, another truth, until he was left completely unmoored. When a demigod is so thoroughly broken, when his every certainty is ground to dust, is choice even a possibility? For in that absolute isolation, chaos reaches out, and it is the only hand left to hold. For every grand design, there is a flaw. For every web of order, a predator that learns its patterns. Here, in the final moments before the fall, we witness the culmination of a betrayal woven across the stars, its corrupted, burning threads consuming all hope. Here, the web snaps shut. Healed? No, not healed. Reforged. As this record attests, the Warmaster was not merely mended, but awakened and healed by dark magic. On the plague moon of Davin, Horus fully embraced the ruinous powers, his soul sacrificed for a dark rebirth. The last vestiges of the noble sun were scoured away, replaced by an infernal ambition. His new vow, sworn in unholy communion, was absolute: to topple the Emperor and assume the mantle of the Master of Mankind. And behind this cataclysmic turn stood its architect, Erebus. With the Warmaster's soul secured, Erebus's design is complete. The meticulously laid stratagem, years in the making, now awaits its prey. The trap at Istvan is set. The galaxy will burn. Thus ends the prologue to Damnation. The tragedy is not merely in the betrayal, but in its perfection. The noblest of suns, the brightest star in the Emperor's sight, twisted into the ultimate weapon against him. The eye of Horus, once a symbol of the Imperium's reach, now stares into the abyss, promising only ruin. What we have witnessed is the precise moment a dream died, the dream of a united, enlightened humanity, shattered by the corruption from within. In this grim galaxy, the path to hell is paved not with good intentions, but with the ambition of gods and the failings of men. This archival record is now sealed. Subscribe to these archives, and in the lumens below, record what chapter of our dark history the Auspex should scan next.